Okay, we'll turn our attention now to the databases that are offered through Azure. And you saw earlier in our AZ900 objectives that our task here is to describe some of the products available on the platform. And that brings us to an important thing to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this discussion. That is that the databases offered by Azure that you can lease in the Azure infrastructure are managed database. So it's a platform as a service. And they include things like Azure SQL, MySQL, Cosmos DB, PostgreSQL, and then finally, we'll briefly talk about the data migration services that are available for you to take existing data and get it into a managed database platform in Azure. So as I'm sure you're aware, you can have a full-time job where you're managing just one of these database products. So these are very specialized fields of knowledge. So we're just going to be taking a very cursory look. That's all our task is right here, to understand what some of the possibilities are. In terms of conceptually looking at databases, let's answer this question. Let's start with this concept here. Why database in the first place? And what I've got here in the background to help us with this concept is a big library, a big stack of books. So imagine walking into a library and looking for a specific book, and the librarian turns and points to the shelf and says, it's somewhere in there. Well, without some organization system, you would have no way of finding that one book. So in any library, you go in and you see the fiction section, the nonfiction section, the reference section, and then within those sections, you've got an organization system. Databases essentially do that very same thing with data. So first and foremost, they allow us to store and organize large amounts of information. They standardize the what gets stored, and the hows, how it is organized. So imagine if you are a firm like Nike and you are selling millions of shoes every month or certainly every year, and you need to track 1 million orders because maybe Brian orders a pair of shoes and then he wants to return it, and you need to look up my order so you can do that exchange. Well, how do you look up that order? You have to be able to standardize what information is attached to a specific order in order to find that quickly. Speaking of, that's another main advantage, a main benefit of a database, which is quick access. Organization equals rapid access to the information stored in a database. Databases also let us extract meaningful intelligence about the data. How many of a particular shoe are getting ordered, and how many of a particular shoe are getting ordered by men in a certain age group in a certain part of the country. All of that can be answered if we have a system to collect information and organize that information, and that system is a database. Then finally, security. You can limit certain access to certain parts of the data for certain users. So again, going back to the shoe analogy or the shoe order analogy, you can go in and pull up all of the orders that you have made and see the information attached to your orders, but you can't pull up the information that is associated with my order. But someone at Nike could be able to pull up both my orders and your orders. So that's what databases are for. And now we'll look at some specific database instances that you can deploy in Azure. Now that we've done a high-level overview of the job of databases in a modern Azure implementation, let's take a look at the specific ones that we're expected to know about for the AZ900. And again, this is mostly just site recognition stuff, because as we get started here, just a reminder that any one of these databases may be a full-time job and is a full-time job for one person or even teams, even departments of people. So our job is just to be able to identify a couple of perhaps instances or advantages, and really the advantages are going to be the same. So anyway, let's start with Azure SQL. Azure SQL is a fully managed service, which means that Azure will take care of all of the hardware that's involved with managing a database, the servers, the storage, the network, all of the infrastructure. So you just worry about the data and the business logic that was identified previously, the analysis of that data. So the fact that Azure SQL exists within the Azure infrastructure provides the advantages of scalability. You can scale up, scale out very easily. Availability, your data should always be available, or at least according to the terms of your license agreement with the 99.99% availability uptime. And if not, your service level agreement would mean that you would get paid for any downtime. Security and storage. Storage means that Azure SQL can handle databases up to 100 terabytes in size. That's quite a bit of data. And by the way, what does SQL stand for in the first place? If you've ever wondered, if you're not Googling this phrase, it's Structured Query Language is what SQL stands for. And the Structured Query Language presents a structured way to access the data that's in the database. You ask questions of the data, and then you get return results based on the criteria that are met by the structure of your request. That's not testable information. It's just a try not to introduce a term that isn't at least given some kind of context. I don't assume that everyone in the world has fallen out of the sky and knows every computing term ever used. Now, speaking of SQL, another commonly used SQL database is MySQL. And this is another option you have within the Azure infrastructure, and it would give you the same kinds of advantages in terms of availability, scalability, reliability, and so forth. The biggest difference between Azure SQL and MySQL is that MySQL is an open source SQL database. And this open source means that it's mature, it is proven, there are lots of contributors who continually update and debug the code, and there are millions of instances in use. The example here is WordPress. So you have already, if you followed along with the hands-on exercises and you spun up a WordPress site, congratulations, you've also become a user of MySQL. Now, that said, WordPress can use other backend databases, and you saw that when we configured that WordPress site. Another database that's in our list of things to describe is this one, and this is Azure Cosmos DB. The DB, of course, stands for database, and what you need to know about Cosmos database is that it is a globally distributed database. So this is kind of an 800-pound gorilla of databases, so this can scale to multiple regions throughout the globe with just a few clicks of your mouse. Now, the advantage of a globally distributed database, or one of the advantages, is that it's fast. So if you have a solution where you need data close to the people who are accessing that data, you want that database to be globally distributed. So the fact that the Azure Cosmos DB can be globally distributed quickly means that users can access data that's stored in Cosmos DB with single-digit millisecond latency times. Now, that's not the cheapest database option that's available at Azure, but again, it is the fastest. Other capabilities with Azure Cosmos DB include automatic scaling and the ability to program and access data and write applications for the data that lives in Cosmos DB using several different programming languages and software development kits. Another acronym here, SDK. A software development kit presents a standard interface for development of applications for data that, in this case, lives in a Cosmos DB. So it's a very large, very fast, and very flexible database. Our last site recognition item is this one, PostgreSQL. Postgres is also an open source piece of software, open source database that's also very big, also very flexible, and because it is open source, it has been used for years and years. Now, about that funny sounding name, Postgres is a successor to something called Ingress database, and because it was developed after Ingress, it was post-Ingress, and then it just kind of got abbreviated to PostgreSQL. And the SQL part of the name just indicates that it supports SQL queries, which is used throughout the database or data access business. Cosmos DB and Postgres are oftentimes mentioned within the same ballpark because they both support large data implementations. So they're used by companies such as Reddit, Instagram, and NOAA to manage, obviously, weather information. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. Instagram, all the pictures that get posted to Instagram, and Reddit, all the posts that get hosted on the Reddit platform. Now, why would Azure support an implementation of Postgres? Well, because Microsoft wants to support a pathway for companies with large data warehouses like Reddit and Instagram to be able to migrate to its services. And in fact, that's what we talk about as we close out this section on storage and databases. I'm sure you've noticed that Microsoft is not a struggling startup, and nor are they run by fools. And so they know that if they can get a company to move from on-premises data storage to cloud-based storage, to Azure-based storage, the greater their chances of having a customer for a long time. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that it's a business necessity. They're competing against Google and Amazon and other cloud providers, and the cloud advantages are pretty self-evident for most companies. The easier Microsoft can make it, the better chance that they have to compete against some of their competitors. So, with that in mind, our job as AZ900 candidates is to understand the purpose of Azure DMS. And Azure DMS is the Database Migration Service. Its job is to help companies migrate on-premises databases to the cloud, specifically the Azure cloud. So we certainly don't have to know any of the mechanics of any of the migration paths. You may want to keep in mind that doing something like moving from an on-premises Microsoft SQL installation to Azure SQL is going to be the most straightforward, because really it's a one-for-one transfer of data. But almost any other scenario imaginable is also supported. And which scenario your organization will need to support is, of course, a factor of the many, many variables that are involved. So with that said, perhaps the best thing I can do is just kind of point you in the direction of where you would go to find the database migration tools. And you can do a search. And this is not something that appears in the portal menu favorites. So you can do a search. You see I've done a recent search. And so if I start typing in MIG or MIGR, you can see that I can quickly get to the Azure Database Migration Services. So if I give this a click, this is the start, and I would create a database migration service here. So what you would do is you would create the service, and then after the service was created and it existed a resource group, then you go into the service and then you start configuring the data migration process that service would perform. Now, fortunately, there's good documentation about what to do in a specific scenario that would match your organization's existing infrastructure, needs, and so on. And that is, you can go to the technical documentation down here at the bottom. That'll launch the technical documentation in a new tab. And if you scroll down to databases, then you can get more information not only about some of the things that we have talked about here, Azure Database for MySQL, Cosmos, and you can see there are others besides the ones that are identified for the AZ900. But for more specific scenarios about the database migration service, you would click here, and it would take you to this page, which again is just really a dashboard where you would then start to look for how-tos, tools and guidance, tutorials for specific migration paths. So there it is. Database administration and migration is a specialized field that takes months and years of practice and study. For now, we just need to know the purpose of the Azure Database Migration Service.